All right, welcome folks as we take our places this evening. Hopefully you all received an outline when you came in this evening. We are at week number 29 in 31 weeks, so we have 2 more weeks after tonight. 2 more Wednesdays, and we will complete this verse-by-verse journey through the Gospel of Mark. Now, if you've been with us, you know the answers to the next couple of questions, but essentially many people wonder, so why didn't Jesus come out right away at the beginning of his ministry and say, "Hi, I'm Jesus, I'm the Messiah, I'm God in flesh, here to save the world"? Why didn't he say that? It's frustrating to some of us when you're first reading the Gospels and you think, Jesus, why are you playing so coy? Well, we've learned through this, because if Jesus did that, right away the Romans would come down and crucify him and kill him right away, because the Romans were highly sensitive to any political uprisings and Jewish messianic uprisings. Plus, the Jewish people right away would put Jesus on their shoulders, and they were thinking political ruler. They're thinking a political king, and that's not at all what the Messiah was all about. That's why Jesus didn't come out right away and make those declarations. So what he did was, he came out and he did things that only God could do. He did things that made people scratch their heads and say, who is this man? And so we've learned, as we've gone through this journey, that you could conceivably break the Gospel of Mark up into 3 acts. Act 1, the first 8 or 9 chapters or so, and the theme is, who is this man? And that was the question that was constantly being asked. He would do things, he would say things, and people saying, who is this man? Who are you that you could do this? You teach with such authority. You do these authoritative acts. You heal, you raise people from the dead. Who are you? And then Act 2 of the gospel begins when Peter at Caesarea Philippi says, Jesus asked them, who do you say that I am? Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And Peter said, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. You're the Messiah. And Jesus said, that's right, Peter. You're right. And that began Act 2, and which the theme of Act 2 is, who is the Messiah? That was the theme. Okay, Jesus says, you're right. I'm the Messiah. But now you need to ask yourselves, Peter and disciples, who the Messiah is. Because for the next chapter, the next portion, act, if you will, Jesus throws out 3 times. The Messiah is going to go to Jerusalem. He's going to be whipped. He's going to be beaten. He's going to be tortured. He's going to be crucified. And on the 3rd day, he's going to rise again. 3 times he made that prophecy. He was trying to get into their heads. The Messiah isn't who you think he is. He's a suffering servant. He's not a triumphant ruler per se. He's not a political king. He's a suffering servant, like Isaiah 53. And then, which brings us to Act 3. And we are nearing the end of Act 3. And the theme of Act 3 is we'll call it the conflict. Of conflict in Jerusalem. We'll just call it that. You could call it several things. But it's Jesus' last week on earth. And Act 3 basically begins with the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. And it's at the triumphal entry that Jesus no longer is coy about who he is. He's in control of this whole thing. He's ready now for the onslaught, so he's ready to declare himself as the Messiah, knowing full well what that'll mean. Knowing full well it'll bring the weight of Rome, it'll bring the weight of the Sanhedrin down upon him. Knowing full well it'll bring his death. He pushes that narrative because he's ready for that to happen. And so that's why he arranges things to go into Jerusalem riding on the back of a donkey and so on, as it's prophesied the Messiah would do. He's out there, he's doing messianic things, and because he's ready to be revealed as the Messiah. So, the last time we were together, we looked at the events surrounding the Last Supper. And at that meal, Jesus established a new covenant, a new contract, rooted not in the bodies and blood of goats and bulls, but in his own body and in his own blood. And today we watch as Jesus is about to face the harsh reality of actually fulfilling that commitment. He declared the commitment at the Last Supper, and now he's about to face the harsh reality of living that out, actually fulfilling it. We tend to have this misconception of Jesus. I shouldn't say we. I did for the longest time. Had this misconception that Jesus as God in flesh was almost kind of robotic. Like, it's like when you are watching a video of an old, when I first saw the Blue Jays win the World Series many years ago, and I was pretty excited when it was live, and then now when I watch the video, it's like, oh yeah, I know what happens. Oh yeah, and here's what happens next. Oh no, don't worry, don't be afraid, he won't strike out. Oh no, Joe Carter will hit a home run and go, there you go. So, we're sort of blasé because we know how it's all going to end. And I tended to think that Jesus was like that when he lived his life. Almost robotic. Yes, I'm going through the motions. It's almost like he's reading a script every day. What do I do today? Oh, today I turn water into wine. Well, that's a good day. It's like he's just fulfilling what he knows is going to happen. He's almost passionless or emotionless about it because he's just checking the boxes in his messianic scorecard. That's not at all how Jesus lived his life. Let's remind ourselves of something when it comes to the nature of Jesus before we unpack the Garden of Gethsemane here, because this will help us. We know when it comes to humans, there's a rule of thumb. Humans have one soul, and that soul is home to one person, one mind, one center of self-consciousness. So that's the rule of thumb for human beings. That one soul is home to one person, okay? So you can't say, hi, I'm Darren, and I'm Bill. And I'm also Bob. No, I have one soul, and this one soul is home to one person, okay? But that's true of human beings, that's humans, but that's not true of God. God is not a human being. God is a completely different class of being. So God is one soul, one essence, but that one soul is home to three persons. Three minds, three centers of self-consciousness. Okay? You say, well, that's not our experience of life. You're right. Deal with it. This is God. One soul, home to three persons, three minds. We are one soul, home to one person. Okay? And those three persons are revealed as the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Three minds, three centers of self-consciousness sharing one soul. Okay? And what Jesus is, what the incarnation is, I wish I had a different color. Let me get a different color of blue. What Jesus is the incarnation of the Son adding a human body to the person, the mind that is the Son. So it's the Son experienced something that the Father and the Holy Spirit have not experienced. The Son added to his mind, his self-consciousness, a human body. That's what's known as the incarnation. That's what we celebrate often at Christmas time, the incarnation, taking the nature of humanity upon himself. Okay? So Jesus then is truly God and truly man. Okay? He's truly God and he's truly man. He has all the attributes of God and he has all the attributes of humanity. He's truly God and truly man. Okay? So the incarnation is the human flesh. At that first Christmas, human flesh was added to the person, the mind of Christ. And we have learned, because we studied the Trinity, remember, and we studied the person of Christ as well, the doctrine of God and so on. And we learned that there are certain attributes that you have to be God, all-powerful, all-knowing, and so on and so forth. And Jesus he still possessed all of those attributes when he took on human form, but he only accessed them when the Father allowed him. Jesus said, I only do what I see my Father do. The Father's greater than I. I've submitted my will to the Father. And so Jesus had those attributes, those abilities, but he only used them, he only accessed them at the discretion of the Father. He was equal with the Father, one God, but he, as the Son, when he took on human flesh, he willingly submitted himself to the Father. So, in other words, when Jesus walked the earth as truly God and truly man, he experienced the full range of human emotions, being truly human, yet without crossing the line into sin. He felt everything you feel, except without it leading him into sin. So, I say all that as a foundation because we're about to see Jesus' humanity on display in a profound way. We pick up the story at Mark chapter 14, beginning at verse 32. So to set the scene, it's a Thursday evening, the last Thursday evening that he'll ever have on earth. They have just completed their Passover meal celebration that we know as the Last Supper. They've walked across the Kidron Valley. Remember our little chart? So we get a sense again of where they are. These are terrible brushes. Or really good markers, one or the other. So remember the temple, this is looking from the side. Then there's the Kidron Valley. Then there's the Mount of Olives. So the temple's here in Jerusalem. This is the Kidron Valley and the Mount of Olives, which is actually bigger than that. And the Garden of Gethsemane is kind of on the slope of the Mount of Olives. So they've walked across from Jerusalem, and it's a 10-minute walk. And they're now in the Garden of Gethsemane. Let's read verse 32. They went to a place called Gethsemane. As your outline says, here's the first blank. You've been dying to fill that in. Gethsemane, it's an Aramaic Hebrew word meaning olive press. It means olive press, okay? It's an Aramaic or Hebrew word meaning olive press. John identifies it as a garden in John 18:1. It's likely an olive grove with a mill for pressing olives, probably. As your outline says, 1b, Jesus went here often, which is why Judas knew where to find him. So Jesus went here often. John 18:2 says, now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas kind of snuck out of the Last Supper and went to betray Jesus. And he said to the Sanhedrin, I know where he'll be. He's going to go to the Garden of Gethsemane. He always goes there with the disciples. So as your outline says, it says 3 here. Did I misnumber it on your outlines too? Does it go 1, 3? Okay, there you go. You're welcome. I'm just moving quicker this way. See, I'm skipping things. Number 3, Jesus takes only his inner circle with him. He takes only his inner circle with him. Okay? Let's keep reading. Verse 32. And Jesus said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. He took Peter, James, and John along with him. So he says to the others, you folks wait here. And then he says to Peter, James, and John, you guys come with me a little further. And he takes them further with him. Takes only his inner circle. Now the question could be asked, why did he just take these 3 with him? Now Mark doesn't say for sure, but they had witnessed, perhaps this could be why, they had witnessed his mountaintop moments. Remember, it was Peter, James, and John who witnessed the raising of Lazarus' daughter from the dead. It was Peter, James, and John who saw the transfiguration. So now they would witness his darkest moment as well. He's mentoring them. But also it could be, as your outline says, they had all declared their willingness to share in his suffering. This is their opportunity to live up to their words. Peter, James, and John were the 3 who said, hey, yeah, remember James and John said, can we sit at your right hand and your left hand? And Jesus said, are you prepared to drink the cup that I drink and suffer like I suffer? And they said, we will. And so they've been willing to share in the suffering they declared. Remember Peter, when Jesus said, you're going to deny me? And Peter said, no, all these others may fall away, but I'll never do it. In fact, I'll die with you if I have to. So Jesus is saying, all right, you've expressed your willingness to share in my suffering. Here's your opportunity to live up to those words. Perhaps, who knows? Number 4, as your outline says, Jesus' humanity is on display in his emotions. We're going to see a few ways that Jesus' humanity is on display here. Again, he has full divinity and full true humanity. True divinity, true humanity. So his humanity is on display in his emotions. Now, as we read these next couple of verses, folks, don't rush past these words. Don't rush past them. It says, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow. Well, how bad? To the point of death, he said to them. He began to be deeply distressed and troubled. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Imagine you're at your local Starbucks or Tim Hortons or McDonald's, and you're sitting across the table from your best friend. And you ask them, hey, so tell me, how are you doing? And they look you in the eye, and they begin to be deeply distressed and troubled. And they look you in the eye, and they say, well, you asked, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Would you say, pass the ketchup? I mean, what would you say at that moment? How would you respond? How serious would that situation be for you? So what's being communicated here? Let's dig into the words that Mark and Jesus chose. As your outline says, these aren't blanks, but I wanted to put the definitions for these terms for you. Deeply distressed literally means to be out of one's senses, to be out of your mind with either amazement or terror, depending on the context. Well, clearly this was an amazement. He was saying, deeply distressed, I'm out of my senses with terror. This is Jesus talking. I'm deeply distressed and troubled. That word troubled means full of heaviness, to have a heavy heart, to feel intense fear. He says, my soul is overwhelmed. My soul, the deepest part of my being, is overwhelmed with sorrow. That's that Greek word paralupos. Paralupos. Para, like we get the word periscope. A periscope is something in a submarine. You put it up and you look all the way around with it, a periscope. Or the perimeter of a building. The perimeter of something is all around it. Para, all around. Lupos, trouble or sorrow. Jesus said, my soul is paralupos. Literally, everywhere I look, everywhere I face, I see sorrow. There's nowhere I can look where I don't experience sorrow. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow. It's paralupos. How bad? To the point of death, which is a hyperbolic, an exaggerated way of describing the depth of emotion he was feeling. Wow. Like, this is intense stuff. That's why I began by talking about the humanity of Jesus. He's truly God, but he's not some automaton. He's not some robot just going through the motions. He is a human being fully feeling this, what's about to take place. So understand something, as your outline says. What's going on here? Jesus isn't worried about what he thinks might happen. Jesus isn't worried about what he thinks might happen. That's not what's happening here. What's happening is Jesus is traumatized by what he knows is about to happen. So this isn't a matter of Jesus being worried. He's not worried about what he thinks might happen. Oh, this could happen, that could happen. I am so worried. No, he is traumatized by what he knows is about to happen. So this isn't worry. This is facing reality. This is Jesus' humanity on full display. As your outline says, number 5, then Jesus asks for their help by assigning them a task. He asks for their help by assigning them a task. Let's read that in the second part of verse 34. So he says to them, stay here and keep watch. Stay here and keep watch. Keep watch appears to be a call to spiritual alertness and intercessory prayer. That's number 5A in your outline. Keep watch appears to be a call to spiritual alertness and intercessory prayer. So Jesus is saying, listen, remain close to me and pray for me. I need people around me right now. My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Please, keep watch. Stay close to me. Pray for me. I need your intercessory prayer. Please. And number 6 on your outline, Jesus' intensity is on display also now in his physical posture. We've seen his humanity on display here in his emotions, and his intensity is on display in his physical posture. Look at verse 35a. Going a little farther, he fell to the ground. So he didn't trip. He didn't kneel. He fell to the ground. Matthew's even more descriptive. In Matthew 26:39, it says, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground, and he prayed. So Jesus didn't go and politely kneel at a rock. He went and he fell prostrate on the ground. Prostrate, not prostate. Prostrate. I always get those two words mixed up. He fell face forward on the ground, completely, overwhelmed with emotion. Number 7, Jesus' humanity is on display in his prayer. Jesus' humanity is on display in his prayer. Again, his humanity is just overflowing here. Verse 35b and 36. When I say A or B, it means that A means the first half of a verse, B would mean the second half of a verse. It says in verse 35, going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, he said, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. Now, that phrase, as your outline says, if possible. In other words, he would prefer to not experience the coming level of suffering. So he's being transparent with his feelings here. If possible, if it's any way negotiable, if there's any way of doing this, accomplishing this mission, without me having to go through what I'm about to go through, let's do it that way. That's what he's saying in his humanity. If possible, he would prefer to not experience the coming level of suffering. He says, as your outline says, the hour and this cup refer to the suffering that was to come. That's what those two phrases refer to. They refer to the suffering that was to come. Remember, Jesus said to James and John, can you drink from the cup I'm about to drink? It was a euphemism for suffering. So, he's saying his humanity is on display in his prayer here. If possible, I'd prefer to not experience the suffering of this cup in the hour that's coming. Letter C, though, 7c, nonetheless, Jesus submits his will to the Father's will. So even though that was all true, even though he'd prefer not, he submits his will to the Father's will. Here's where I want to hit the pause button for a moment, and I'd like you around your tables to discuss this. What do you think we can learn about prayer from what we just witnessed from Jesus in the garden? I'm going to give you some thoughts for perhaps a model that we can learn about prayer in a moment. But around your table, discuss this for a few moments. What do you think we can learn about prayer from Jesus' example here in the Garden of Gethsemane? Talk about it for the next couple of minutes. And then we'll come back and I'll give you some perhaps thoughts of my own. Let's pick it up. Hopefully you had a good discussion around your table about that. Here's some thoughts, just as I looked at it, that the box on your outline next. Here's Jesus, a model for us for prayer. 3 key things. First of all, as your outline says, I learned from this, express to God your honest thoughts and feelings. So prayer isn't about saying what you think God wants to hear. It's about expressing your honest thoughts and feelings. This summer, we're doing a sermon series we're calling Playlist. And it's basically taking some 8 or 9 Psalms and teaching from the Psalms this summer. And the couple of the ones that I'm going to be preaching from are what are called imprecatory Psalms. And those are Psalms where it's just gut-level anguish. One of the Psalms, the psalmist says, God, I just wish you'd take their babies and bash them against the rocks. What? You don't often get that on a little napkin and your precious moments things or whatever, right? It's like, that's gut-level, ugly stuff. What is that? That's somebody, honestly, this is what I honestly feel, God. I'm not saying it's right. This is what I feel. So express to God your honest thoughts and feelings. Secondly, bring to God your needs and desires. Bring to God your needs and desires. Father, if it's at all possible, may this cup pass from me. That would be my desire, But then, express to God your willingness to trust and submit. So you've told him how your thoughts and your feelings, your needs and desires. And then you conclude, though, by expressing to him your willingness to trust and submit. Nonetheless, all that being true, not what I will, but what you will. That's Jesus' model for prayer here. His true divinity, his true humanity on display. So, the little phrase I've given you at the end there, prayer isn't about imposing our will upon God's will. Prayer isn't about imposing our will upon God's will. It's about aligning our will with God's will. It's not about imposing our will upon God's will. It's about aligning our will with God's will. A lot of people seem to teach or believe about prayer that it's me holding my breath until God gives me what I want. And that's how I prove my faith, by I'm not going to move until you give me this, God. I'm proving my faith. No, that's not what prayer is. It's not about imposing my will upon God, praying and praying and praying until I get what I want. Prayer is about submitting myself to God, aligning my will with God's will so I'm hearing from him and living out what he wants for me, aligning my soul with his mind. Okay, so some thoughts on prayer from the Garden of Gethsemane there. Number 8, Jesus' inner circle now lets him down. His inner circle lets him down. Remember, he took his inner circle with him. They let him down. Verses 37 to 38. And this isn't a surprise to him. He knew this was happening, right? Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Simon, he said to Peter, are you asleep? Couldn't you keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you'll not fall into temptation. The spirit's willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, interestingly there, we don't see it in English, but in the Greek language, Peter is addressed singularly. So he says, couldn't you, and that word you there is singular. Couldn't you, Peter, keep watch for 1 hour? And then, while watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation, that word you is in plural. So the first you, he's just talking to Peter. The second you, he's talking to all of them. Couldn't you, Peter, keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that all of you will not fall into temptation. That's sort of a blending there, isn't it, of human responsibility and God's empowering presence. Watch, that's our human responsibility. And God's empowering presence, and pray. So you're watching, you're doing your part, and you're praying, you're trusting God to do his part. It's a combination there in that encouragement from Jesus. And then as your outline says, 8a, he contrasts our intentions, your spirit is willing, with our frailty, your flesh is weak. So he's contrasting our intentions with our frailty. Spirit willing, flesh is weak. Spirit there meaning human spirit, not the Holy Spirit. Okay? He means the human spirit here. He's not talking about the Holy Spirit. And flesh meaning the weakness and frailty of our bodies, as opposed to how the Apostle Paul later uses the term flesh to mean the sinful nature. He's not talking about flesh in the sense of the sinful nature that we all have. He's talking about flesh in the literal sense. So your spirit, you have great intentions. Your heart is right, but your body, your flesh is weak. It's making it difficult for you to do what you want to do. Now, when Jesus says fall into temptation as well, he isn't saying pray so that you will never experience temptation. That's not what he's saying. He's saying fall into temptation. He's saying meaning don't fail the test. Pray so that you're not saying pray so that you will never see a pothole. He's saying pray so that you won't fall into the pothole when you come across one. I'm not praying that you'll never see a pothole again. I'm praying that when you see one, you won't fall into it. Okay? Pray that you won't fail the test. Now, here's a question, and we won't have much time to unpack it, but was Jesus somehow less noble than others who have died a martyr's death? We hear stories of people who bravely face, martyrdom. Was Jesus somehow less noble, less brave than them? There's more going on regarding Jesus' death than meets the eye here. This isn't just about physically dying. This was about the trauma of becoming a curse for us. As Scripture says, this is about taking the weight and the responsibility of the sin of the world upon himself. This was about becoming sin for us, is what Scripture says. And Jesus had to process all of that within the confines of his humanity. So he's stretching humanity to its very limits. This is God in human form having to process with the confines of his human emotions the truth that all the sin of all the world is about to be placed upon his shoulders. I don't know how you fathom that, but that's what he had to process with his human emotions. The pattern of the disciples being unable to remain awake repeated 3 times here until finally the betrayer and the moment of betrayal arrives. We see that in verse 39 to 43. Let's read that. Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. They didn't know what to say to him. Remember, they've had 3 or 4 cups of wine with the Passover meal, if it's a typical Passover, so they're kind of feeling a little bit drowsy. Not saying they're drunk. No, I'm not saying that. Don't send me emails. But Passover was about a wine. It's late at night. They're feeling sleepy. Returning the 3rd time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough! The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's go. Here comes my betrayer." And just as he was speaking, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders, meaning the Sanhedrin. So that leads us to letter B in your outline. Jesus is arrested. And so we have B1, the arrival of Judas. The next blank is the arrival of Judas. Judas had slipped away at some point during the Last Supper, the Passover meal. But now he arrives, likely accompanied by the temple soldiers and possibly some Roman soldiers. It's not unthinkable that some soldiers from the Antonia fortress, which was a Roman fortress attached to the temple, that some soldiers, Roman soldiers from the Antonia fortress, came along to ensure no messianic uprisings were about to take place. Remember, the reason why Pilate wasn't up in Caesarea Philippi, where he normally was, but he's down in Jerusalem for the Passover, was because the Romans got very nervous at Passover, because this was sort of had some political undertones to this festival of being set free from Egyptian bondage and so on. So the Romans were always nervous. They'd put some extra soldiers in town for this Passover festival. So it's quite possible that the Sanhedrin enlisted some of Pilate's men to assist them in their temple guard with the actual arrest. And then number 2, the arrest of Jesus. We had the arrival of Judas. Now we have the arrest of Jesus. Even at his betrayal, Jesus remains in charge of things. Let's read it in verse 44 to 46. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. Here's what he said. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him and lead him away under guard." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Rabbi," and kissed him. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. You say, what's going on here? Well, in the darkness, again, it's at night, it's in darkness, Judas had arranged a signal. And the signal he arranged was the cultural sign of affection. Now, why did they have to even make this kind of arrangement? Well, again, the Sanhedrin's thinking. They had to think on the fly here. Judas has come. I know where he'll be tonight. I can lead you to him. So the Sanhedrin says, okay, take a guard with you and go arrest him. Now, how is the guard going to know who Jesus is? It's not as though his picture's been in the paper. He's been on CNN or Fox News. I mean, how do they know who this Jewish guy from Galilee is? So Judas says, okay, here's what we do. And the Sanhedrin probably said, listen, we got to sneak up on him because he could run away if he sees us coming. So we got to do this in a way that he doesn't see us coming, and then you point out who he is, and then we'll pounce. That was the thinking. They didn't know Jesus would just stand there. They thought, hey, for all we know, the disciples may scatter or run or attack us, so we have to do this in a stealthily way. So they thought that Judas was the only one who could get close enough to Jesus in the group without arousing suspicion and without giving Jesus a chance to escape. So they arranged a signal. So to the soldiers, Judas said, listen, you guys hide in the trees, and the one that I greet is the one that you should then quickly arrest. Now, a kiss on the hand or on the cheek was a Middle Eastern, still is, a Middle Eastern sign of hospitality and friendship. It indicated family affection. Both Peter and Paul encouraged greeting one another with a holy kiss in the New Testament. That was a Middle Eastern sign. That's what Judas was doing. So Judas greets Jesus with a physical gesture of affection, a kiss, and a verbal expression of respect, Rabbi, which means my master, my teacher. I mean, how sick is this? But that's the greeting he chose. And then number 3, we have a violent outburst. A violent outburst. Look at verse 47. It says, then one of those standing near drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. So one of the disciples, or one of those standing near, we know who it is in a second, draws his sword, strikes the servant of the high priest, cuts off his ear. This is recorded in all 4 Gospels, but Mark gives us the fewest details. As your outline says, 3a, Gospel of John, John identifies the attacker as Peter and the victim as Malchus. Malchus, M-A-L-C-H-U-S. M-A-L-C-H-U-S. So the attacker is Peter, and the victim, the high priest servant, one of the guards perhaps, is Malchus. Luke and John identify it as the right ear, and Luke even tells us that Jesus then reached out and healed this man's ear. Now here's an interesting insight. Some scholars believe that Mark's refusal to name names, because why do the other gospel writers name names and Mark doesn't? And remember, Mark came first, scholars believe. This was the first gospel. Some scholars believe, this is an insight, we don't know for sure. I think this is kind of intriguing though. I read an article on it. One of the people at Broadway gave me this article, and it was fascinating. That some scholars believe that Mark's refusal to name names in this instance is a result of the early date of this gospel. How so? Because Mark is protecting Peter from more trouble. Peter was still alive when Mark first published his gospel, and so were the guards still alive who were involved that night. And so if it got out that it was Peter who was living in Jerusalem for a while, as the guy who sliced off the ear of the soldier, that person, Peter, would be a target of revenge amongst the local guard, the local police. So Mark has to keep the identity quiet because it's an early gospel. These people are still contemporaries, they're still alive, so he doesn't name names. Other gospel writers who wrote their gospels later, when Peter had already died, were not under such constraints. Interesting. Number 4. Jesus rebukes his opponents. He rebukes his opponents. Verses 48 and 49. Am I leading a rebellion, said Jesus, that you have come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you, teaching in the temple courts, and you didn't arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled. So Jesus isn't trying to avoid capture or evade capture. He's showing his followers that he's not resisting. I'm not running. I'm not hiding. I've been out in public the whole time. Here I am. Well, what happens next? Keep reading, 50 to 52. Then everyone deserted him and fled. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. What's going on here? Well, as predicted, number 5, Jesus' followers abandon him. He said that would happen. Strike the shepherd, the sheep will scatter. So his followers abandon him. What's with the story of the naked guy running away? Scholars have surmised who that was and what this was about for centuries. Again, his anonymity, the fact that Mark doesn't name him, is perhaps seen as a sign that he was still alive and was wanted for escaping capture, perhaps. Some think it was Mark himself making a cameo appearance, but that doesn't have much support among scholars. What is the most likely reason for this being included? As your outline says, 5a, the unusual story communicates the chaos of that moment. Many scholars think this is Mark communicating the chaos of that moment. Everyone fled. Everyone ran. It was chaos. There was one guy who just had his outer garment on. He started to run. The guards grabbed him, ripped his outer garment, and all he had was, he was naked underneath, and he kept running. I mean, that's how crazy it was. That's what they're communicating. Well, then Jesus is taken before the Sanhedrin, verses 53 to 54. They took Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests, the elders, and the teachers of the law came together. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest, and there he sat with the guards and warmed himself at the fire. So as your outline says, Jesus is taken to a specially called meeting, and Peter, following at a distance, tries to blend in with the crowd. So Peter's trying to blend in, okay? So after initially fleeing, Peter had doubled back, and he's followed Jesus and the guards at a distance. He follows them to the home of the high priest, where a special late-night meeting has been called. While Jesus has been led inside, Peter hangs outside with some servants, guards, other employees of the high priest's office and household. What's the purpose of the special meeting of some of the members of the Sanhedrin? Remember, the Sanhedrin was the religious supreme court for the Jews. They had civil authority, but they did not have ultimate authority. They could not sentence someone to death. They had religious authority, but they didn't have pure federal authority, if you can think in those terms. So the purpose of this hearing was to get their story straight. They didn't have time to agree on a plan of action since Judas's offer came out of the blue. So they're making this up on the fly here. So now they're trying to stitch together a solid case that they can take before Pilate and the Romans to have Jesus killed. They have to somehow validate and prove that Jesus should be killed. They don't have the authority to kill him, only the Romans do. So they got to make something up. They got to stitch together a story. They're moving on the fly here. They needed something that warranted a capital crime. They needed something that rated the death penalty in Roman eyes. So they're searching for that. So as your outline says, number 2, an attempt to smear Jesus goes nowhere. An attempt to smear him goes nowhere. Verse 55 to 59. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they didn't find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements didn't agree. Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I'll destroy this temple made with human hands, and in 3 days we'll build another not made with hands. Yet even then their testimony didn't agree. And besides, that was a religious thing. That Romans wouldn't kill him over that. So they're stumbling around here. Clearly, this wasn't a trial in any fair sense of the word. Nonetheless, they were trying to at least make it appear fair and appear as though they were following biblical protocol of having at least 2 or 3 witnesses. But their so-called witnesses couldn't get their stories to match up. And by the way, at no time did Jesus ever claim that he would destroy the temple. Jesus was referring to his body, and he said, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again. So they're slandering and misquoting him. Number 3 in your outline, frustrated, the high priest tries to get Jesus to incriminate himself. To incriminate himself. Spell that. Incriminate himself. That means he tried to get Jesus to say something to get himself in trouble. Okay? It's like you do when your little kids are in trouble and you're trying to get them to tattle on themselves. Did you take that cookie? No. Then why do you have chocolate on your face? Tell me more. You're trying to get them to tattle on themselves. That's what they were doing. Look at verse 60 to 61. Then the high priest, he's getting frustrated. Nothing's working. He stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What's this testimony that these men are bringing against you? But Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? And Jesus' answer startled them, as your outline says. Number 4, Jesus' answer startled them. Look at verse 62. I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. The coyness that Jesus displayed for the first 3 years of his ministry is now gone in Acts 1 and Act 2 of Mark. Since he's arrived in Jerusalem via his triumphal entry, he has placed his messianic status front and center. He kept it relatively hidden, verbally at least, up until now, because he knew what it would bring down upon him, Roman and Jewish elites' attacks. It would have short-circuited his ministry, but now the time is right. His life and his deeds and his teachings have all aligned. They've all done their work. He has powerfully proven who he is, so now he can publicly proclaim who he is. And so as your outline says, he applies Psalm 110, verse 1, and Daniel 7, 13 to 14 to himself. He applies these 2 passages to himself. Jesus mixes together 2 Old Testament passages declaring universal, eternal sovereignty and power, and he applies them to himself. And this shocked the crowd, as evidenced by the response of the high priest. Look at verses 63 and 64. The high priest tore his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses, he asked. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? They all condemned him as worthy of death. So as your outline says, number 5, Jesus' claim to such authority was considered blasphemous, as evidenced by the high priest's symbolic gesture. Tearing your clothes like that was a symbol of blasphemy. His claim to such authority was seen as blasphemy. Verse 65, then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him, struck him with their fists, and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. So as your outline says, their long pent-up rage boils over into physical and verbal abuse. They've been angry at him for years, and now it's just boiling over into physical and verbal abuse. Meanwhile, while Jesus is faithfully confessing the truth inside, Peter is cowardly denying the truth outside. We pick it up in verse 66 to 68. While Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came by. When she saw Peter warming himself, she looked closely at him. You also were with that Nazarene, Jesus, she said. But he denied it. I don't know or understand what you're talking about, he said, and went out into the entryway. So as your outline says, a servant girl passing by gets a closer look at Peter and recognizes him. She recognizes him. And 1a, Peter denies it and positions himself for a quick getaway. So he gets out to the entryway. He gets away from the fires out by the gate. And says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand. What are you saying? This doesn't make sense. And then number 2, the pattern is repeated 2 more times. The pattern is repeated 2 more times, verses 69 to 71. When the servant girl saw him there, she said again to those standing around, this fellow is one of them. Again he denied it. After a little while, those standing near said to Peter, surely you're one of them, for you're a Galilean. He began to call down curses, and he swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. As your outline says, Matthew tells us that his Galilean accent gave him away. Matthew says that it was his accent that gave him away. And then verse 72. Immediately the rooster crowed the second time, and then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and wept. So as your outline says, Peter the rock hits rock bottom. Wish I could say I made that up, but I read that somewhere. Peter the rock hits rock bottom. A rooster, a symbol of strutting and pride, reminds Peter of his foolish boast. And Peter won't be mentioned again in Mark's gospel until the second last verse of the last chapter. By the way, when you come to Israel with me in March, we're going to go to a place, they've actually discovered the ruins of the high priest's house. And there are stairs there, for those who came with us last year, as our Jewish guide told us, those stairs right there are the stairs that Jesus would have walked up from Gethsemane. They're still there. And we went into a cistern in the basement of the high priest's house that Jesus most likely spent the last night of his life in. It was perhaps the most sobering moment for me on that whole trip. I'd never experienced that before. I'd never gone to this place before, and it was the first time I'd been there. It's quite sobering. So when I'm reading this today, I'm picturing in my mind those places that we were. Next time we're together, we'll look closely at what takes place at Jesus' trial before Pilate, his death on the cross, and his burial. That's next week. God bless you, folks. For those on video, we'll hopefully see you next week. And now, any questions from the chosen few in this room today? Questions about what we learned today? Yes, Ash.
How does Mark know everything that happened in the garden? Because it's pretty detailed without actually being there. Did he survey James and John and Peter?
Yeah. Remember that Mark's source for this gospel was Peter. So Peter was Mark's apostolic source. Now, he had other sources, but Peter was his main source. This is sort of Peter's version of angle of the life of Jesus. Yes?
Concerning prayer, it says here that we're to give him our needs and our desires and trust and submit to. So do you keep praying and praying over and every night go to bed?
Yeah.
So God, here's me again. Or do you just say it once and trust that he's going to answer?
What a great question. And you know what? I was going to mention something. The question is, do you keep praying the same thing over and over again? What do you do? And look at here's what jumped out at me. And I didn't say anything when we were doing the teaching because I knew I would have to move quickly tonight. But look at chapter 14, verse 39. Once again, Jesus went away and prayed the same thing. I found that profound when I read that. I said, look at that. Jesus went back. He just prayed all this stuff. Lord, Father, if it's possible, take this from me. He went out. You guys are sleeping. Come, please pray for me. He goes back. Father, if it's at all possible. And the Father didn't say, you just said that. I'm aware of that. So in our humanity, keep praying, keep asking, and don't stop asking. Until you get a clear answer. Yes?
When Jesus chose Judas,
Yes.
one of the disciples, do you think he knew that he was
That's a good question. Absolutely, I think he did. I would think that he... Well, I don't know for sure. I shouldn't say that. I think he did. But as off the top of my head, I can't think of a passage that says... at some point, Jesus became aware, before the event happened, that Judas was the one who would betray him. But at what point in Jesus' life and ministry the Father made that aware to him, I don't know.
So Judas in some way was chosen.
Judas? Judas was, yes, Jesus personally selected the 12. Yeah. Yeah, which made the betrayal all the more painful.